right. Well, it is 4 o'clock. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Climate Live K12 session for students, educators, and the public. This is a video series brought to you by the Columbia Climate School. My name is Laurel Zaimashihi, and I am the Assistant Director of K12 and Continuing Education at the Climate School, and I will be facilitating the session today. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with the Columbia Climate School or joining us for the first time, our school was founded in July 2020, and it's Columbia University's first new school in 25 years, dedicated to advancing transdisciplinary climate research. As a hub for innovative climate solutions, the Climate School brings together experts from across fields to address the most pressing climate challenges of our time. The Columbia Climate School is committed to shaping future leaders to drive climate solutions forward in every sector by offering educational programs for degree-seeking students, high school students, teachers, professional learners, and the public. And by equipping changemakers with knowledge and skills, the Columbia Climate School empowers essential stakeholders in the fight for a just and prosperous society on a healthy planet. So what we're hoping to do with these Climate K12 sessions is to introduce you all to the interdisciplinary work through our scientific experts and practitioners. These are monthly sessions that have run throughout the academic year. You are joining us for the last session of the year, and so you will have to rejoin us again in November for our next annual series. So today's session focuses on food systems and climate. The session's entitled Pathways to Climate Resilience in Agriculture and Food Systems, and it's led by Dannie Dinh, the program manager for the Food for Humanity initiative at the Columbia Climate School. I'm going to hand it over to Dannie in just a moment, but I want to remind everyone that the chat is disabled, but the Q&A is open, and we really encourage you all to ask questions for Dannie. Feel free to populate the Q&A as soon as a question pops in your head, and we'll make sure we have time at the end to answer it live. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dannie.
Thank you so much, Laura. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to be doing the last session. So thank you for tuning in just before you start your summer break. As Laura mentioned, I work in researching and applying projects that kind of cross between food systems and climate change. And so because we have a really diverse audience and we have short amount of time, I want to just make sure I breeze through, all of these topics, and then I'll try to answer as many questions as I can at the end. There's a lot of graphic, a lot of data visualizations. It's okay that, you don't spend all of your time trying to figure out what they are. I'm going to try to give you a summary. But the topics that we're going to examine together, first of all, I'm going to just have to run through the whole overview because our food system's so complex. There's so many different aspects to consider. And then we unpack the emissions that arise from food and agriculture activities. What are the risks and what are the vulnerability that these systems are facing? And then based on that, we can examine a couple of examples of solutions. These are our pathways forward to climate resilience and food and nutrition equity access for all. When we talk about food systems, what I mean is that everything involved in what it takes to get the food from the soil as the crop product to your plate, and then the leftovers that are not eaten, that are discarded as waste. So there's all the trucking, all the packaging, the marketing, the food that are presented in store on the shelf that you see, all the cooks and chefs that are preparing the food. All of these actors and steps are part of the food system. And the food systems are both a victim of climate change, as being affected by climate change, but it's also driving a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions and other land use change, environmental degradation. It's also driving climate change. So there are solutions and opportunities that are embedded throughout the food systems that could help us mitigate and adapt to climate change. So the first part, we're gonna kind of look through the problems. What are the problems for our food and agriculture systems? Why is it not good for people and the planet? We've heard a lot about climate change affecting agriculture and food. but it's more complicated, right, than just heat and drought and flooding event affecting crop growth. Climate change can also affect our food system throughout the food system. So, could affect from direct impact. It could indirectly affect through reduced water quality, or because there's less food produced, there's also less access to food, to cheap, affordable food, for example. So you see all of these effects throughout society, also all the way to the nutritional value at the end, whether or not we're eating healthy diet, healthy foods. So all of these effects can take multiple loops. They amplify each other. It's not isolated. And if we take a little step back, not to the beginning of agriculture, but just to the pivotal point that led to, agriculture, industrialized agriculture systems as we see it today. We figured out how to produce a lot of food. And this is thanks to this process called the Haber-Bosch process. We use a lot of energy to grab nitrogen out of the air, turn it into ammonia and other fertilizers that are helpful for plant growth. So compared to just naturally plant now all of a sudden have all of these added nutrition so that they could grow much faster, much bigger, is also coupled by, remember, at the end of the 19th century, we also see the Industrial Revolution. We also see crop fields getting bigger and bigger, which means machineries are required. Heavy equipment are required. Irrigation is added because rainfall is not enough. So the labor force become mechanized. And of course, this comes with a heavy cost on the environment, right? More machinery, larger fields means more greenhouse gas emission, more fossil fuel usage. And then there's also all of these events, as we know it: colonialism, war, displacement of people, wildlife, ecosystems. So in short, we produce a lot of food, more food than we need to feed every single person in the world, even as population continue to rise. But as we know it, we continue to have hunger and food insecurity and malnutrition in a lot of places. So overall, let's look first at the graphic on the left. We see that our food production dominate a quarter of total greenhouse gas emissions, right? From everything that we generate that emit greenhouse gas emissions. And then after that, you see the breakdown within food itself, right? Food production itself, it's pretty evenly spread between all of these different elements of food systems, as we saw in the circle earlier. And it's more than just greenhouse gases. We're talking about environmental degradation. We're talking about land use, about water use, about the displacement of wildlife or the reduction of biodiversity. So there's a lot of other effects alongside with greenhouse gases, which we can measure pretty concretely. We have crossed a lot of these our planetary boundaries in order to continue to sustain our populations, as well as the general stability of the planet. And then when we look into the different ecosystems that have been impacted by humans, we see that there in the lower quadrant, in the pink area, there are some ecosystems that are more affected, or they're now less intact, right? They're lower on the vertical bar. And then in terms of size area, they're also being reduced. So they're not as biodiverse, but they're also getting smaller and smaller. And those are the grasslands, the temperate areas, the very flat area that's easy to grow food and to build things. And then even our tropical forests, the lungs of the earth, they are now starting to get conservation investment. They're getting protected status from the governments, but that doesn't mean that agriculture activities are not encroaching and continuing to degrade these systems. And it's a big chunk of the native ecosystems that we take over, we convert it into cropland and pasture for grazing animals. So agriculture of all kinds are the leading driver of land use change in the past 35 years at least. And then if we just focus on one particular pathway, which is the use of synthetic fertilizers, as opposed to just having the crops grow naturally or by pairing different crops with each other, we can see that, not all of the fertilizer we put into the soil actually get used and uptaken by the plants themselves. There's a tendency and a lot of incentives for farmers to over apply. Companies, will recommend higher amounts, for example, so they can sell more. And then half of this nitrogen sort of go to crops. About 1% of this is going to be combining, interacting with other elements, and they become air pollution and greenhouse gas as we know it in the atmosphere. They also, when it rains after an application, all of that water also carry fertilizers into our waterways, into stream, rivers, ocean. We have eutrophication, we have algal bloom, a lot of other problems down the line. And then there's one particular thing that that we don't really talk about a lot too, is that by continuing to apply fertilizers, we also kind of train plants to be adapted to just having fertilizers available, and the fertilizers kill the mycorrhizal networks, that these fungi that help plants' roots fix nitrogen, or they help plant roots uptake nitrogen, for example. So we're just kind of degrading the ability of crops themselves to naturally absorb the nutrients in the soil as well. There's also, as we globalize our food production, we also see that some of the crops are just dominate, right? Maize, wheat, rice, and soybeans, they're everywhere. And then there's a lot of these indigenous or locally consumed crops, like teff or like other grains that are, local. They're produced less. There's less of a global demand for them, less incentive for farmers to grow them. So it ends up also concentrating the market share to a handful of companies that sell the seeds. So this kind of like, creates a lot of risk, because first of all, we see the lack of genetic diversity. If one company is supplying seed to many, many farmers, they're all growing the same crop, which means they're more susceptible to the same outbreak of disease or the same drought event or the same flooding event. They all are pretty similar as a group. There's the lack of variety also means that we're going to have shortages of a few key groups. If these events, these bad events happen, it means we'll also consume a lot of the same foods and have less balanced diet and nutritious diet. And when we talk about food insecurity and nutrition, we also see people in some countries, having much less access to food than others, and on all of this are not always driven by climate, right, and weather extreme. It can be also related to conflict and insecurity, all of these other issues going on in the region, all of the other shocks and effects from the overall economy. And so in summary, everything is interrelated. What about our food systems? What do they look like? So around the world, not every country have, agriculture as their primary dominating source of GDP for the whole country. But we see that, the higher percentage of the labor force in a country, those concentrate in Africa, in Asia, for example, that is not a large part of the population of the US or Europe to partake in agriculture activities. And that tends to correlate with country income, overall income. So the GDP per capita, the richer you get as a country, the less of your people are going to be working on the farms employed in agriculture. And the lower your GDP per capita, the higher share of agriculture as part of your economy. There's also a lot of different farming systems around the world. Maybe it's rain-fed, relying on natural rainfall, perhaps is irrigated because rainfall is not enough. There's also different climate, different crop suitability. So here's some photos of what these different systems look like. I'm going to focus a little bit on the far right, which are these smaller scale farmers who farm on much smaller plots of land. They have a lot fewer resources to deal with, let's say, a sudden shock of like a heat wave or a hurricane affecting their crops. They don't have a lot of savings, so they might lose everything within a bad season. And that means that they have less ability to take care of their family, for example. Farm workers, people that are employed seasonally to collect crops at the end of the season, they bear the brunt of all of these threats of climate change. They also already are marginalized. They're paid less. They're not protected in many ways. And in a lot of countries in the US, they're also considered temporary and disposable. And here's the productivity and yield around the world. There's bigger gaps that exist in some countries over others. And then this is the places where you have greater land and water scarcity. So you see there's some correlation between the areas of high productivity and yields as well as they're the same areas that have really high water and land scarcity. And maybe a natural reason is that if you have very little land and very little water, you want to make the most of it. So you want to be able to make the most with the little resources that you have. Farmers are affected by climate change as well as the little more shorter term changes within the climate system. So there are many different aspects of the food system and agriculture that if you choose to solve this problem, then you could decide to focus on just one or aspect or a solution that could be cross-cutting. We have diverse agri-food systems, and there's different contexts. Can't apply the same policy in India as you do in Senegal. It doesn't make sense, right, to use the same solutions everywhere. But you have to define the problem, describe the problem, and assess what are the opportunities and the resources. But in short, to farm means you're going to create an impact. There is no zero impact farming. You can improve it, you can reduce the impact, and you can try to, but that means that it's going to have some trade-offs. That means you're going to lower the yield, you're not going to be as productive when you try to lower, the use of synthetic fertilizer, for example. The cost of the end food product might be higher. Just think about, the prices of organic food products compared to regular, for example. Not everyone can afford that. So that is another trade-off of, growing foods more sustainably. And there's also the types of products might change. Meat that we're going to talk about shortly is not sustainable. And if you're going to try to make the system more regenerative, more better for the earth, it means you're going to have to switch from meat to something, so it's another source of protein. So changing to all of these systems take time, it takes resources, and it takes a lot of convincing because farmers need to have an income, right? So they have to be able to make that switch without sacrificing their income and livelihood. So we have to think about system change outside of just food and nutrition policy alone or agriculture policy alone. We have to look at the entire system and like across different systems. How could we, get multiple benefits from all of these, from the policies that we design? We want to, if we're going to talk about building a better, more equitable, more sustainable, resilient food systems in the face of climate change. There's a great resource if you want to look at food policy within the US. Here's another resource to help you look at the indicators within the food systems around of each country around the world, or at least wherever there's data available. So there's different indices. I'm not going to go into them. But climate adaptation, right, to adapt to these changes that we cannot, we don't have a choice. But at the same time, if we ignore mitigation, we're going to end up with something called runaway climate change, runaway greenhouse effect, which means we don't really know what's going to happen. So we do have to make an effort to reduce all of these in all of these areas that generate greenhouse gas emissions. So meat, as you can see at the top in the red bars, the dot is the median point. So they tend to be much higher in greenhouse gases, land use, energy use, acidification of potential, eutrophication potential. The long bar means that different systems can have different levels of effect. So overall, they skew higher, but we know that we can try to, make the systems more efficient, more sustainable, more regenerative. But at the end of the day, we just have to reduce emissions overall, which means we need to cut out these really high emission products. There's also was a question about pork and chicken. It's not, it's not as high as meat, but let's say, could we try to supplement or swap out those for other proteins that comes from legumes and produce? There's also food waste and food loss that contribute to a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and this tend to be higher in developed countries or in places like cities and urban areas where we throw a lot of things away, or if things don't sell, they get tossed away. So there's waste, and then there's also loss. So what are the ways that we can try to change that? We see a lot of community farms and gardens now in urban areas, and they're great. They have so many benefits, and they should be continued to be promoted and expanded. But at the end of the day, we cannot feed millions of people with just these small gardens alone. It comes as to supplement whatever foods we can grow in other areas where we can grow foods better. And it's not always about combating risk, right? We can also use information to help climate farmers become more better equipped to deal with whatever climate impacts that come their way, or they could also increase the productivity of their crops with climate information. We can also try to restore ecosystems by combining it with growing the crop species that are native, that are beneficial to help reinforce the coastline. But that doesn't occur everywhere, right? In some places it works. In some places, you're better off just converting the ecosystem back to what it should be. So these are just some really quick touch on some of these solutions. I hope that maybe we'll get to the questions and try to see if there's any other solutions that people are thinking of. But I also want to have a quick plug for the podcast that we've been producing from the Food for Humanity Initiative team. And the first topic is already out and available, but we're also releasing soon the second series on plant-based diets and alternative proteins. So that is it for me. And now we can get to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Danny. I love that you really, there was so much to go through in such a short period of time, but I think from this presentation, what we're really learning is that it's not just the production of food. It's so much more than that. It's the waste. It's about policy. It's about how you farm and how you produce food, how you ship food around the world. Like, it is just such a complex system. So when we're thinking solutions, we also need to think of it as a system and think system solutions. So we do have a ton of questions already, which is amazing. Someone first asked a little bit indirectly related to food systems, but I guess in the production of food system or in the production of food, how it gets to us in our grocery stores often requires plastic packaging. So how is that plastic packaging having an effect on the environment?
Yeah. So first of all, plastics are made from fossil fuels, right? So that you already know in order to get fossil fuels, petroleum, you have to emit a lot of greenhouse gases and you degrade the environment just to get the resource. And then once you produce plastic, it stays forever. There is no real way to, break down plastics at scale yet. Yeah, we can try recycling, but not all plastic, especially plastic bags, they are not recyclable. And even the recyclable plastic, they can only be recycled at most one time. And then after that, the quality is not the same anymore. And it's also very costly in terms of energy and money in order to make that happen. And then, when companies tend to make these packages very fancy, very glossy, very, large, but, it's not an efficient way of packaging the food product. So when you stack them on the shelf, when you stack them in boxes for transport, that can take up a lot of space, which means you can transport less product per, the vehicle or the freight that you have, available. So that's just some of the examples about plastic food packaging effects.
Yeah, the thing that drives me crazy is like so much of this produce, like they don't need packaging. Like a banana has its own little package around the fruit. So
Yeah.
why do we need like plastic around the banana? It really blows my mind. So hopefully we can move away from that. Someone asks, how are climate change shifts in weather patterns expected to affect global food security, and what promises do you think show I think what farming practices do you think show the most promise?
So this is a really big question to answer because global food security involves so many different systems, right? And each one of them are affected differently by climate change, climate impact. So let's say we zoom into the Horn of Africa, which is an area that we know are very heavily affected and linked to El Nino, Southern Oscillation events. So when we can detect that, this is an El Nino season, which means that we see some signs of, the higher subsea sea surface temperature rising in a particular region in the ocean. We call this, El Nino is coming. This is an El Nino year. What does it mean for West Africa is that they're going to see, and I'm speaking from memory, so I may be wrong, but let's say that it's going to be really dry during the growing season. So that means that farmers, if they know ahead of time, they can switch to farming drought resilient seeds that are a little bit more expensive, but it guaranteed that their yield is not going to be affected. Or they may switch to a different crop product. But if they didn't rely on that information and they just plant per usual, expecting a certain amount of rain in a certain amount of duration and time frame, and they don't get that, that means a lot of failure across the growing season, and they end up losing all of that crop, for example. So that's just one example. I would highly suggest that you try to, just take an area, for example. What is the food production system there? What does it look like? Is it industrialized? Is it small scale, smallholder farmers? And then try to understand what are the biggest climate risks that are affecting that region. And that's how you can see those pathways. And then overall, when you add all of that together, that makes up the global food production, right? So to answer that question, it's complex. We don't know what's happening. It depends on what we decide to do in the foreseeable future as well.
Thanks, Danny. We have a question here that says, I know that the usage of fertilizers is responsible for preventing starvation in less developed countries. I've also heard that consuming produce grown with GMOs induce the risk of or increase the risk of cancer. Do you think there is a middle ground, as in a safe, regulated amount of pesticide usage?
Yeah, so I am not an expert on GMO, but technically speaking, it is just a different variety of crops that we have essentially engineered to have a certain characteristic or a certain quality. For example, like maybe the different color than it usually is, or maybe like they're bigger and more like, fragrant. Maybe the taste is more sweet or something like that. So plant breeding has always, happened throughout history. That's how the banana looks like, what it looks like now, right? But so we can't kind of lump everything together as bad. Certainly, if let's say farmers are sold a seed that is engineered to only grow once and does not produce any additional seed that they can save and then use that to plant next season, that's a bad thing, right? Because farmers then have to go back to the sellers to get more seeds and every time and then they end up become very reliant on the producers of the seeds rather than being able to cultivate their own variety, conserving the heirloom or the heritage seed varieties that come from their own location, their own family, or their own community, for example. So that's one example, but I would not say that all GMO are bad, right? We have to look at that. What is it? Where is it? What kind of food product? So yeah.
Yeah, totally. I'm also not an expert on this, but it's something that I've dug into quite a bit because it is concerning. But I do want to just clarify the a plant that's grown using genetically modified, like as a genetically modified organism, doesn't automatically mean that it's increasing the risk of cancer. I think the challenge is that when you have this huge agricultural farm, you want to maximize your yield and minimize pests. So there is a lot of pesticide usage, particularly from like a company called Monsanto that has a lot of links to cancer. Now, the challenge with that is yes, it's like killing off. These pesticides are so strong, it's killing off everything. It's like a biocide. It will kill everything, including the crop that you're trying to produce. So what they've done is they've created a GMO plant that is resistant to dying from that pesticide so that it can survive while everything around it is dying so you can maximize yield. But that plant still absorbs the chemicals and then we eat those chemicals and that can cause a lot of health issues. So that's the challenge if you're using GMOs in that way. But to Danny's point, like there are a lot of incredible, groundbreaking ways that people are genetically modifying organisms and plants to be like drought resistant so they could be more climate resilient or like plants that can grow faster or bigger so you could have more food, things like that. So it's definitely not a catch-all, but that is kind of the link between why people are like GMO equals health issues. It's because of that like whole pesticide challenge.
That's really
Um,
interesting. The pathways. Yeah.
yeah, it's complicated, but it is so important, and I'm glad people are starting to become more aware of it. Okay, we have a lot of questions, but not a lot of time. So what are some good sources of protein for those who want to reduce meat consumption?
Uh, let's say, peas. I don't have the top of my head, but I eat a lot of tofu. I try to add a lot of green produce to my diet. And then I try to make sure I also eat a variety of things as well. So yeah, I think peas, nuts, uh, oats, just yeah.
Danny's a vegetarian, so
Yeah, so
from
so I know
experience.
what I eat, but I actually don't know which one's the highest in protein. Is that bad?
Okay, someone says, I agree with beef having higher greenhouse gas emissions, but when it comes to land use, is it just by acres? Because most of the land beef cattle used is marginal land. They're actually adding more to the food system, but by utilizing land that's not suitable for anything else.
I would not agree with that statement everywhere. So that might be true for some area where it's really arid, there's nothing but grass that grows there, right? And so people have like free range pasture for cows. Sure, that could be that, the cow is adding some manure back into that environment. But in general, where cattle are produced, we go back to this image. This is what you see on the right-hand side, right? That's industrialized farming, and that happens in a lot of places, especially in, where agriculture is intensified and industrialized. Animal welfare is really low. There's a high concentration of animals, so high concentration of the manure, of the runoff, of the byproduct, of the resource use in those areas. And then what you see in the middle, that doesn't happen everywhere. The entire North America, much of it used to be like prairies, right? And we convert much of those prairies where, it's native grassland into agricultural land as we know today. And then so people might say that, oh, there used to be free-ranging animals back in the day, and now we're just replacing them with cattle. But it's really not the same. Cattle don't graze, that we breed don't graze the same as wild animals. They pull out, the whole plant at the root, so they're actually destroying more plants than just, trimming and grazing them, and then the plants grow better. Or something like that. So it's really not the same. It's different everywhere, but overall, the emissions from greenhouse gases come from land use change. It comes from the concentration of the animals, the methane that just come from the cow digesting the grass. So all of that adding up to, significantly more greenhouse gases than other food.
Thank you, Danny. Just a few more here. What are a couple things that we can do here in the US to help reduce agricultural impacts on climate?
So, just think about your own consumption, right? Think about like, what are the things I eat, the things I do that, is very emitting, like meat, ruminant meat, as I mentioned. Dairy is also really high in terms of greenhouse gases because they come from cows. So you have to have the same cows that have to be cultivated. And then, when you're buying food, are you buying just enough so that you have very little wastage at the end that you have to throw away? Or, are you buying and then you forget about it, and then at the end, right, you're losing money and you're losing really good food that could have been eaten. And then, a lot of community gardens, and in a lot of communities, there's also an effort to compost, to keep food waste out of the solid waste stream so that we don't end up sending all of that into landfill. And that's like a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions that we're talking about that could be sort of diverted. Could we compost, we generate what is called soil amendments that could then be added back into the soil, help enrich it, help restore the health of the soil, and keep it, within the community as well. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways that you can make an impact as an individual. Once you start thinking about it, once you start learning about it, it's really easy. It's second nature. So I would say, yeah, do not undermine the effect of individual actions.
I love the idea of eating more locally and eating seasonally, because if you're eating something that's out of season, it means it's getting shipped from far away places. That also is, a carbon intensive shipping process. So those are a few things that I like to do as well. And then the last comment, I love this so much. Someone said, "Thank you so much. It is so interesting. I hope my generation can do better and help create more supporting policies." I completely agree. I mean, the work is being done right now, and we hope the next generation will continue to keep growing it.
Yeah. So I recommend Ernias to take a screenshot. This provides you with at least 3 different papers that talk about the effect of grazing animals driving the deforestation in South and Latin America. So just take a screenshot, and then you can see in the bibliography and see a lot of related research that way.
Awesome. Thank you, Danny. We
Yeah.
love resources here. Well, thank you, Danny. We are over time. Thank you everyone for joining us for the last session. This was so fun, so enriching, I think, for all of us, and it really empowers us to make little changes in our own life regarding what we eat. So thank you, Danny, so much for
Thank you, Laura.
All right, bye everyone.
Thank you,
Hope to see you
everyone.
next year.
Bye.